Hey everybody, welcome to Culinary Characters Unlocked. I'm David Page. On this episode, a Michelin star-winning chef who's worked for Jean-Georges Vongerichten, Thomas Keller, and in some of the most storied restaurants in France before building a culinary empire of his own. Here's John Fraser. Chef, thank you for doing this. How are you?
Great, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. So I was struck by a line in your biography, quote, "Restaurateur Chef John Fraser made his mark on the culinary landscape by redefining the role of vegetables in American cuisine." How'd you do that?
It's pretty audacious.
Well, it's on your website.
Yeah, that's true. What I would say is that, I grew up in California and worked in a lot of great restaurants that served a lot of great vegetables, but they were almost always the side dish or the accoutrement to the dish. As I saw the landscape changing, and many of my colleagues in the sort of mid 2000s were getting, pork tattoos on their forearms and cow tattoos and steak tattoos, and I was just watching cooks kind of veer one way and our clients start to veer another. That was during the Atkins crisis, which was when nobody was eating gluten. I don't know if we remember that. And I was watching a lot of our guests become very health conscious and start to focus less on red meat. And I started to look at what was happening in my own diet as well. As I was aging, started to ask myself, does it make sense to eat the way I'm eating? Should I be making changes? So I started personally to pull away meat in my diet. So I'm probably 99 or 95% plant-based today, me. And in my restaurant, which at the time was Dovetail on the Upper West Side, I was having a very slow summer. And I said, what if we just do a little pop-up on Mondays? We'll call it Meatless Mondays. We'll put together a menu. And then all of a sudden, when we did that, it was like a little prefix. It was affordable. I looked out at my dining room and everyone in it was not the guests that I was used to serving. So we touched on a completely different style of guest, different qualities that they wanted in their food. But more importantly, I realized that they were being underserved. In other words, there wasn't a fine restaurant with a vibe that they could find themselves in and still express their eating habits. So we saw people of religious origin that we did not previously serve. We saw people with health issues that we did not previously see. And we saw people who had, sort of eating habits in the way of plant-based eating that we didn't previously see. So all of a sudden now the door was open to a new audience. And so through that, we started to really make a lot of changes on our menus and focus on that guest and allow them more options.
Like what? What did you offer? What do you offer today? What do you eat at home? What's a good meal that doesn't make me say, well, this is good for vegetables, but I sure wish I had some prime rib?
Sure. I mean, very simply, my favorite dish, which is cacio e pepe.
Possibly my wife's as well.
Pasta, water, cheese, and pepper. So that's a vegetarian dish, right? It's not. It's plant-based.
Is there a skill to making it?
Well, I would say so. For me, the sin in cacio e pepe is not melting the cheese. When I've got sort of bits of cheese floating around in it, to me, that's where it becomes more about the cheese than the balance between the simplicity of just those few ingredients.
Well, balance in anything is key.
Yeah, and a little technique. Yeah, that's right.
Were you one of those kids who was in the kitchen going, I want to do this when I grow up?
No, I was one of those kids who said, what are you doing? I think it was curiosity that was expressed in childhood, not necessarily around that being a choice in terms of what I wanted to be when I grew up. It was much more a curiosity about almost everything. And that was the one that happened a few times a day in our house. So that curiosity was awakened.
Well, who cooked at home? Mom, dad, both?
Both my parents. Yeah, both my parents did. My parents both worked a couple of jobs, were very, very hard workers. And my dad, I think, and this is my psychologist talking now, my dad was having trouble with eating when I was a kid. It turns out he's celiac. but that was before that was a regular diagnosis. That wasn't a normal thing to hear back then. Now it's very regular. In fact, I think many people might be lying about it.
You think the guys who say they gotta have gluten-free bread and then they order 6 beers? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But back then that wasn't a normal diagnosis. You didn't see that out in the wild at all. And so my psychologist believes actually one of my interests in food was trying to solve my dad's illness. Food was making him ill. And so as a kid, feeding off of that energy, the solution for that is to understand the food so that the child self can solve the father issue. Anyway, let's go back to the fun stuff. I love restaurants, and I always have. We were never in restaurants as a kid. We were kind of lower middle and poor. And we didn't ever go out except for when we got good grades. So it was like once a year type of thing. We would go out.
You only got good grades once a year?
Well, we got rewarded once a year for good grades.
Gotcha.
Right. And
I'll do well in math this quarter because we're coming up to dinner. Okay.
That's right. Exactly. It's like a bonus cycle in a corporation. Yeah. Just to have a strong fourth quarter and you may get there.
Well, what'd you eat at home? You talk about having a Mediterranean background.
Yeah.
Were you eating Greek and Turkish? I mean, are your parents or grandparents?
Yeah, my mother is partially Greek. But we had California cuisine. So we had a garden in our backyard. We had fruit trees and avocado and lemons. And so we had, sort of homegrown style cooking. Very, very simple. But I would call it probably closer to Betty Crocker than Mediterranean diet, right? It was sort of the cuisine of the time. And it was from two hardworking parents who didn't have a lot of time, but both of them are quite healthy and are concerned with nutrition and always have been. So there was always this sort of like food as play in the house. And there was a lot of focus on dinner table, right? So there was like a non-starter dinner, my sister and I, every day, everyone together. That was a moment where a gathering happened. So that sort of hospitality stuff was rumbling in there by way of, an alarm bell went off and everybody went to the table.
What were your favorites as a kid?
Favorites as a kid?
I was big on SpaghettiOs, so...
Yeah, it was such a simple diet. But, a lot of this, like, the kind of working class food that we had was, like, put it in the crock pot and put it on low and then come back and put it over rice or mashed potatoes and suddenly it was ready.
Crock pot for time or crock pot to make delicious an offcut?
Yeah, well, both, right? So the cheapest thing sits around all day at low temperature, becomes edible with some spices and tomatoes, and suddenly you have something that started off as inexpensive but becomes somehow luxurious, but more importantly, comforting.
Well, isn't that to a great extent the story of some of the world's great cuisines? Born in poverty, had to find a way to use a hard-to-use product or make something bland taste better?
I would say, moreover, every cuisine, right? High cuisine is only a recent thing. There was the high cuisine of just the kings and lords, and that was a very, very small piece of the population. Everyone else was eating, aforementioned crockpot style cuisine.
So when did you realize this could be a living that you wanted to make?
In college.
And by the way, diagram that sentence. Good luck.
Yeah, right, exactly. Someday. In college is when I started to realize.
Where'd you go?
University of California, San Diego.
You aren't into weather.
No. It was a fantastic place to be as a college-age kid, for sure.
Is San Diego a good food town?
I think it is becoming one now.
When you were in college, maybe it was more...
It was its proximity to Mexico that made it so great. So we got a lot of Tijuana-style Mexican food.
Define Tijuana style. I mean, to me today, it would be birria, but even though that was born in central Mexico. But what were you eating as Tijuana style Mexican food?
California and Mexico as amigos, to me, is Tijuana style. So a lot of fresh produce, and the Baja region of Mexico is great for growing vegetables. So there's a whole lot of cactus and a lot of stewed and grilled meats over the small tortillas, double wrap. For us in San Diego, there was a lot of the California style burritos, the sort of thing that became Chipotle. We subsided on those. You could eat one a day and you were good. That was my experience with cuisine, was really proximity to Mexico. Before then, even, I hadn't really ever been to a fine dining restaurant until I was actually working in them, for not out of curiosity, but out of lack of funds. Everything was about chain restaurants, and food was just living. It wasn't about pleasure or curiosity or anything else, like all the stuff that it becomes something out of fine dining.
So were your taste buds awakened in college?
I think they were. My first job cooking was, my first job in restaurants, I was in college, and I was a dishwasher, and I worked my way up to short order cook.
Does that happen often?
Not anymore.
Now you got to come out of culinary school or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have a mixture of entry level folks that come in and or self starters and people that went to culinary school. Yeah, and I would say actually really important to have a little bit of both. It's important to have a little, the grinders and the people that come in with a little bit more of an intellectual approach. And I think that, having all grinders maybe makes the kitchen a little bit more rowdy, and having all intellectuals and nobody wants to get down on their hands and knees and scrub the floor. So it's a nice mix to have both types. It's
like drafting for a bowl team.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. So during college, I was working in bars and restaurants, and, I was sitting in class and saying, God, I can't wait to get to where my people are. That community, that sense of belonging. I've always been a late bloomer. And that sense of belonging I found in the kitchens and in the bars and in the restaurants. I felt like part of a tribe. And then I would go to college and I would have one or two friends, and I'd be like, I just can't wait to get back to that, that rowdy group of pirates. And so I found myself pulled first as a community, and then second as curiosity, and which led to this question of, do you want to be a cook? Do you want to be a bartender? And I found so much creativity in the cooking part as I was introduced to it, and watching over real people's shoulders and saying, oh my God, how did they come up with that? Like, where does that come from? And so from there, I just made the leap after college. I went and worked in Los Angeles for a chef that I had met in New York City. His name is Pino Luongo. He's a famous, kind of maybe a few generations ago, Italian chef. And he had a restaurant called Coco Pazzo in Hollywood, West Hollywood. And so I was a short order morning cook, and I worked my way up to sous chef in that restaurant.
Okay, let's not jump over that. There are people who have it and people who don't. And to say you worked your way up to sous chef in Coco Pazzo, that clearly you had something. When did you realize you had it?
Not there. I just, I come from a working class family, and it was all about, I would come early and not punch in so I could learn butchering. And I would stay late with the pastry chef in order to kind of watch over what they were doing. I also have a level of imposter syndrome that I drag around like an empty leg.
After your Michelin star and your New York Times 3 stars and all that.
Yeah. But that imposter syndrome of me being kind of promoted probably too quickly, let's be honest, it led me to this place where I said, like, well, the only way I'm going to figure this out is if I overwork everyone, right? So I was kind of doubling everyone's kind of experience, and I was starting to jump over people. Along with it, at that time, I was one of the few white guys in the kitchen. It was mostly Latinos, and I learned to cook from them, right? They taught me how to cook, but I could pick up the phone at the end of the night and place the order. And so therefore I got promoted and they didn't. And I'm not saying that's right. It just was. But so many of the people around me, by way of kicking my ass, that being the Latino guys, gave me the gift of quick learn, right? And it's not to say that we're ever done learning, but I got the base there. And my insecurity about not having gone to culinary school led me to get off of work and jump into the books and be a self-starter, and then go back to work and start trying things out. So it was very much a place where I could learn without a spotlight. That was my Los Angeles experience. And from there, I went to work at a hotel called L'Hermitage, which is a very high-end...
L'Hermitage in Beverly Hills.
Yeah, in Beverly Hills. That's right.
I don't recall the food there. I assume it was good.
Yeah, it was good. It was a chef. He was doing some Asian stuff. And And it's something that I hadn't had any experience with. And I really wanted to like try and understand what those flavor combinations look like. I was also at the same time helping my friend open the Standard Hotel in West Hollywood as a runner. I was a food runner. I was the morning sous chef, and I get off work and I was a food runner at nighttime because I wanted to see what this thing called lifestyle was. Lifestyle hotel restaurant. And that was actually Jean-Georges.
And what is that thing about? What is it? The food? Is it the music? I've heard some chefs complaining lately that it's all about food, music, not food. So
yeah, well, I think what it does is it, all of us, when we go out to eat or when we go out for an experience, I think subconsciously we answer the question of like, what do we want to be tonight, right? Like, what kind of person do we want to be tonight? In lifestyle style restaurant, right? It suggests that tonight it's about like community and meeting people and being loud and boisterous. So maybe as we're creating a hierarchy amongst the question of what's more important tonight, food, wine, cocktails, music, who else is in the room, right? Those types of things. I think in fine dining, food comes first and then beverage, right?
Does it?
I think so. Yeah. I think that's, to me, fine dining, you have to create the time and the space for it. And I think that cuisine is probably the leader when it comes to fine dining. But in lifestyle, I think it's almost everything else, and food, last or second to last. But I think that all of us can say that we want to participate in those things, maybe just not all at once. And that's what lifestyle restaurants are, which are exciting places to be, but maybe not about the food necessarily.
As a chef, does that piss you off?
Not at all. Not at all. If you try and go out and have your brain turned on all aspects at all times, it's exhausting, right? Sometimes the food is just something to keep you drinking so that you can have a night out. I think that there has to be space for all of these things.
As a restaurateur, let's be blunt. Your profit on alcohol far exceeds your tiny little profit on food, right?
Yeah.
So there is a place in the business line of it for the $20 martini.
There is. And the other profit center for us is really events.
At a hotel restaurant.
At almost every restaurant, because you have a kind of pre-prescribed deal that you're kind of feeding people at, right? You know how much they're going to eat, you know what time they're going to come, you know how many there are. So you can kind of situate a smaller staff around an event versus an a la carte restaurant where everybody's sort of running around trying to figure it out. Every night's a new night, basically. But you can't really have a great events business unless you have great food. So in a way, the food may be quote unquote a loss leader, even though we still make profit on food. It's not the most profitable, but it feeds the rest of those things. And it's very unlikely that a place that does lifestyle can have a 20-year run or even a 10-year run. There has to be, I think, a Rubik's Cube of all of these different kind of focuses. But the question is, which side are you looking at, right? And I think that's what lifestyle restaurants answer. But I loved being a part of it because it was a bunch of really hot people having a great time and eating Jean-Georges food. Jean-Georges was the chef there. And the high and low of that was fascinating.
Was he a significant influence on your cooking?
No, I mean, not at all. He has such a distinct style that only he can pull off and that only he should do. I think he's on Mount Rushmore of chefs. I think he's fascinating, and his scale with quality is unbelievable. Like, there's very few that will ever do what he's done again.
Who else is on Mount Rushmore?
Thomas Keller is my number one. I had the great benefit of working for him for 2 years at the French Laundry.
What's it like?
It was incredible. Yeah, it was incredible. It was, the most meaningful life and career growth that I had ever had.
How? Why?
I was not qualified to be in that kitchen.
But he hired you. He must have seen something.
Well, I became qualified, but I was not qualified upon getting hired. It was the most talented group of people in a single room that I've ever seen since or before. And everyone was pushing to be the best. That for me was, the pinnacle. And so Thomas for me is always going to be number one.
I had the privilege of being in the kitchen of the Linea with Chef Grant Achatz. And the first thing that I noticed was how quiet it was. Mm-hmm. There was no yelling. There was no screaming. No one was throwing anything. Mm-hmm. What's the kitchen like with Thomas Keller?
Same. Yeah, very same. I mean, the one thing I would say, and Grant is a friend of mine, so I don't mind kind of, Grant and I worked at the French Laundry together. So he was a sous chef. But I don't mind saying this, but at Alinea, there's a lot, and I am poking a little fun here. Alinea, there's a lot less cooking going on than there was at the French Laundry, right? Alinea is very precise, but it's on a much smaller scale. At the French Laundry at the time, there was a lot more sort of classic French suite style cooking, where you've got these pushed together ovens and stuff and pots flinging around. In Grant's kitchen, he's much more kind of smaller scale with his dishes, but also the style of cooking that he's doing is in one part assembling, and another part still cooking.
I talked about quiet kitchens. You talked earlier about a rowdy band of pirates.
Mm-hmm.
The culture in kitchens came to a reckoning a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
In cleaning things up as they should be, did some of the baby get thrown out with the bathwater?
Perhaps for a certain group of people, that was the reason they went to work. For those of us that were taking it seriously the whole time, whether it be the interpersonal stuff or it was the drug and alcohol stuff, for me it was always a distraction. I treated it as a profession, even when it wasn't my profession. I took it very seriously. I still think that there are kitchens that you can find that still are a lot of fun, and the reason that people go to work in those kitchens is because they want to have fun and work. It's just not my preference or my style. The kind of extracurricular stuff that was happening in kitchens, which is happening in almost every job, it's just for whatever reason, restaurants become this sort of litmus test or measurement of what happens in culture. I think it was always unhealthy. It never really made sense, and it was unhealthy for the people who were doing it also, right? I mean, no one acts like a total asshole at work and then goes home to their family and is able to totally code switch to not an asshole, right? So you carry that thing around with you, whether you know it or not. And I think that a lot of the corrective stuff at work is important.
How do you keep the assholishness out of your kitchens?
I'm not sure we necessarily do actively, but a lot of it starts with hiring, and then it comes with a lot of management. We do have an amazing HR department who takes this stuff very seriously, but the self-policing activity now, where people are just not willing to put up with bullshit, the people reveal themselves very, very quickly, and we've got zero tolerance policy now.
When did you, or how did you move from working for other chefs to becoming a restaurateur to becoming the owner of multiple restaurants?
So I was coming back, I was working in Paris after I worked at the French Laundry.
I'm sorry, we jumped over that. Where the hell were you working in Paris? I
worked in Taïwan and Maison Blanche and Arpège. So I had 3 really amazing kitchen experiences there in Paris.
Those are all Michelin-starred restaurants, are they not?
Yeah. I left the French Laundry because I felt like I needed a finishing school, because everyone around me was highly educated in culinary arts and I had zero. I definitely wasn't going back to college to receive a culinary degree, and I knew that because the kids that were coming out of culinary school to the French Laundry, who were working as my prep cooks at the time, the education part of it was not doing them any favors in terms of were they able to actually become a good cook, right? And to be clear, it's nothing against the education in culinary arts to say that just because you have an education doesn't mean you're good at it. And further to that, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs to do in post culinary education as a culinary graduate. Working in a kitchen in fine dining, it doesn't require it. There's a lot of other jobs in culinary education that absolutely do require it, and that education is put to good use.
Such as?
Recipe work, cookbook work. There's a ton of corporate jobs. Think about the thousands of people that get fed in prisons, in cafeterias, right? Having that style of culinary education and that rigor around culinary education is really important for that style of job. In fine dining, at least in my experience, that wasn't ever a prerequisite. But I did feel as if at the French Laundry, I was feeling quite insecure around the fact that I had a good resume, but I didn't have a culinary education. So I decided to move to Paris to work for a couple of years to sort of what I would say kind of finishing school or round it out. But I also, I had worked my ass off for so many years and I never saw anything except for the inside of a kitchen. And I wanted to actually taste French food in France. I had never been to France. So again, life plus work was happening there in terms of growth. So coming back to New York City, my father, again, he hated his job. And I had a chance to come to work at a great restaurant in New York City. And I said, I don't know, maybe this isn't for me. And a friend of mine was opening a very small Greek restaurant in the West Village. Luck is part of my story as well. It happened to be the year that the Greek Olympics were happening. A Greek restaurant plus the Greek Olympics meant a lot of shine on Greek food. So we had just opened as the Greek Olympics were taking off, and this little 45-seat restaurant got much more attention than it probably deserved at the time, if I'm being honest. And all of a sudden now I had a name in New York City. I'd never run a restaurant. I'd never been the chef of a restaurant. It was my first time. And all of a sudden I sort of put myself in a position to have a couple of choices and a little bit of agency. And I did a couple of years there. And then I was like, I think I should go back to a fine dining or something a little bit more upscale. It was very much a taverna style cuisine. And I got a job at a restaurant called Compass on the Upper West Side. And that was quite a large restaurant. It was probably 180 seats or something. And so we were trying to do great cuisine at scale there. And it had a couple of failures, and a couple of chefs went through there that didn't do very well. And I worked, I don't even know, I think I worked like a year straight, didn't take a day off.
You were the executive chef?
I was, yeah, the executive chef there. And essentially, I was able to figure out a lot of stuff, and I was able to kind of tweak my voice and figure out what I actually cared about. And I put it down on a piece of paper called the menu, and we started cooking, and I had a great team. And it took about a year, and we got reviewed by the New York Times by Frank Bruni, and we got a great review. And I went from sort of maybe something to someone who really had some agency, and I started raising money for Dovetail Restaurant. So that was my first restaurant that I owned and was the chef of. And that's going back 2007 or so.
Then where'd you go?
So Dovetail was 10 years. We had 10 years.
And it got everything, right? What'd you win?
Yeah, we got a 3-star New York Times review. We got Michelin star. That's where I started to develop this voice around vegetables and vegetarian cuisine. And from there, we opened Narcissa inside of the Standard Hotel. So full circle, I worked as a runner at the Standard Hotel in West Hollywood, and ended up being the chef of the Standard Hotel on Bowery. So at that moment, I now had a fine dining restaurant on the Upper West Side and a lifestyle fun restaurant on the Bowery. And that's where the sort of idea of being a restaurateur and having more than one restaurant kind of operating under one umbrella started to develop.
How many restaurants have you opened?
Been a part of opening and opened personally, yeah, probably in the 20s, maybe more, that we own. I don't know, 6 to 18, something like that, plus or minus.
Tell me about Iris.
So Iris is our Greek restaurant. It's in Midtown West, and it is a sort of hybrid between taverna cuisine that is an everyday food with some creativity by way of some of the Eastern European spices and fats involved. So one of the things that I love Greek food, but at times I say, like, God, I wish there was a little bit more butter in here, a little bit more spiciness to it, right? Whereas if you're in Turkey, right, which is the next door neighbor to Greece, you say, like, man, this is pretty heavy. I wish there was more olive oil and more lemon here.
Okay, explain the difference. What's a Greek dish that's can be bland? What's a Turkish dish that's just too much? Because to me, moussaka will put me under the table. That's a Greek dish. It's heavier than hell. But give me a couple of specifics.
I think that most people, at least in the circles of New York City, associate Greek cuisine more with the island's cuisine. Right. So that's a grilled piece of octopus with a little bit of lemon vinaigrette and some capers, right? Or a grilled fish with some parsley, olive oil, and lemon, right? That is the association that most people have with Greece because, frankly, the media has done a really good job of selling this an incredible part of the Aegean Sea. It's an incredible part of the world as a vacation destination. Turkey, on the other hand, uses much more of where Greece is olive oil, Turkey is butter and animal fat, right? So you have a very different approach to cuisine as a result. Turkish, spices are much more Middle Eastern influence, where the Greek spices are much more European influence. So mint, dill, parsley, and then from Turkey, it's cinnamon, allspice, sumac. So what we tried to do at Iris, and I think successfully so, is try to bring just a little bit of that Turkish spice to the Greek cuisine and create a little bit of a modularity between like a straight Greek dish, which is this light and easy and fun grilled fish, with maybe a Turkish spiced octopus with a little bit of candied kumquat, for instance. So we're borrowing from our neighbors, and our neighbors have the lines of our neighbors have been changing over the millennia, where people are sort of, depending on which war it is.
Look, relations between Greece and Turkey have been lousy for years. Is there a concern in melding those two cultures?
I'm not sure we're trying to meld cultures. I think that, my approach was a little bit more like, when you're in the Aegean Sea and you're looking out to the land, do you know which country you're looking at?
No.
So binding a cuisine to a country felt, in the case of Iris, as, let's be a trader in the middle of the Aegean Sea, and allow ourselves to borrow spices from Israel and Lebanon and Turkey and apply it to Greek cuisine and amplify what I think is one of the best cuisines of the world, which is Greece, with a little bit of our neighbors' influences.
The average American probably thinks of Greek food as flaming cheese,
right,
spanakopita, and if you really want to get ripped off, throwing plates, because what tourists don't know in Greece is that they charge you per plate after encouraging you to throw them. I assume you disabuse us of that at Iris? What's on the menu there?
Well, the one thing we do focus in a lot in is our pita program. So I think that's another thing that when you think about Greece, you're thinking about a stack of pita that shows up, that was made somewhere off-site and diced into little triangles that you're supposed to swipe through meze with. So we make our pita, it's a sourdough starter, and we make it in the moment when you order it. So it comes out as this sort of like puffy little pouch. And that hopefully sets the tone for the rest of the meal. I think that a lot of times Greek cuisine gets a bad rap because it feels a little bit lazy, and that's sort of like a bunch of spreads and a pile of, cardboardy pita. We set the tone from the very beginning with that bread program. So we absolutely do the meze as you would. We create a couple little moments here and there. Our hummus, I think, is the best in the world. We really put a lot of love into the normal things, the expected things. How do you serve a Greek salad in December? Right? It's based on all summer ingredients. So we're spending a lot of our time on sourcing, right? So where does the tomato come from? And does it come in ripe? The answer is no. So we have racks on racks of tomatoes at room temperature, shelf ripening for our Greek salad, right? So it's not probably any different than the ingredients that you would find in your kind of taverna Greek salad, but we're really focused on the parts that separate it from the taverna, which is a ripe tomato, as an example.
I'm looking at the menu here. I'm seeing slow roasted short rib. Do they eat short ribs in Greece? And by the way, I'm not a stickler for authenticity, quote unquote. I hate that word. But are you doing that in a Greek way?
You have to ask yourself, what is Greece, right? And how do you define it, right? Most people, especially in the summertime, define it as just island cuisine, right? So it's mostly based on the things that you would catch off the edge of your island. There's a whole highland cuisine of Greece, which is based on lamb and beef, slightly less so. River fish, like trout, for instance, right? And birds, like quail and squab. So what we're trying to do is represent the other parts of Greece during the winter months that you maybe wouldn't find in your island cuisine. And that's what's being expressed there, right? The mountains and the highlands of Greece are slightly more heavier and influenced by more preserves, where the islands of Greece are much more just straight to the grill, olive oil, lemon, capers.
I notice you do a quail kebab.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Again, that's pulling from the Highland cuisine, and we actually use a mixture of Aleppo pepper, so Turkish spices, super hot grill, and finished with a Greek vinaigrette.
And you've got something on the menu here I haven't had since my grandmother made it. You sell a lot of sweetbreads?
Yeah, we do.
Really?
We do. Yeah.
Because nose to tail's a tough sell in America, isn't it?
Not in New York. For people who know, they seek it out. The other thing about New Yorkers, it feels to me like they eat for sport oftentimes, and menus can be quite homogenous, right? It works one place and you continue to do it elsewhere. So in the case where you have someone who's willing to kind of take a chance on you, you oftentimes take it. That's a kind of a New York sensibility, I think.
That must be great as a chef.
It really is. Yeah, New York is the best place in the world to be a chef. No doubt about it.
Really?
No doubt about it.
This from a guy who's cooked in LA, cooked in Paris. What makes New York so good? Just the openness of the clientele?
It's the openness in the clientele, and it's the access to ingredients. Everything has to come through New York. So truffles all have to come through New York from Alba, right? Everything has to come through New York in order to get to the rest of America.
So you're picking off the good stuff before it.
We get it first, and we have an embedded clientele that takes pride in originality. And you don't find that everywhere. New York values originality, which makes it one of the best places to eat in the world.
Your website discusses your wine program. Mm-hmm. I'm going to appear absolutely ignorant here because I am. I've spent a lot of time in the Med and in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. How do I phrase this? Greek wine, like Retsina, which can taste like a shoe, mm-hmm. was always seen as cheap and fun, but certainly nothing serious. Mm-hmm. Are there Greek wines that would fit as serious? Are there Greek wines that compare to California or France or Italy?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's Greek and Turkish wines that are world-class. Where you're right is the fact that the PR and marketing hasn't reached a global audience. Where I think you're also right is that the struggle with a lot of the higher end Greek and Turkish wine is that it should cost as much as a fantastic Sancerre or a fantastic Chablis, right? But people look at those two labels differently and they don't value them the same. What they've gotten over, I think, in the last decade is the storage issues, right? So the cart getting the wine from port to port had created some cases that weren't always 100% great. And that, along with bad PR and marketing, I think has been solved in a way that you're going to start to see world-class labels put on Greek wine especially.
Greek wine, Greek food, it's kind of like Chinese in one respect. Americans don't necessarily value it as anything more than quick and cheap. How do you change that?
If you have ever had a grilled octopus and a glass of Moscosfilero on Santorini, that solves it right there. Right. So I think it's really about the transportational solve, trying to get people to Greece or you're solving the curiosity around Greece. I think that's probably where it is. But I kind of also like that it's not so ubiquitous, that there is a sense of discovery. I like that it's not so easy to find great things, because when you finally find them, you're like, oh my gosh, like, where was this been?
Are you doing Greek food at North Fork Table and Inn, or is
no?
It? Okay, so you like the New Yorkers in Manhattan. Then in the summer, when they take off for their enclaves on Long Island, you got them there too. Tell me about the North Fork Table and Inn.
So North Fork Table and Inn was a historical, it's been passed through a couple of generations, and we bought it pre-COVID. And refurbished it and put it back online as a new American restaurant. It's one of my favorites in our portfolio. It's very small. It's about 75 seats or so. And, we try and really focus on the fishermen, the growers, and the farms of that region. And in doing so, you have something that really feels like this little moment that can only happen at that address. We're quite seasonal, right? We open early in the year, but it's quite slow there. We get rocked from basically like June to middle of October or something in there, right after picking season with the wineries, and then it goes to sleep. We have an amazing seasonal staff that kind of moves between restaurants, and they all find their summer thing out there. But it's a magical place. There's real farms there, real vineyards. There's a connection with the sea. We're flanked by the Sound and the Bay on each side, and there's amazing fish coming out of that water. And it's expressed in this kind of like seasonal thing. And every year we get to kind of, because we close, which is very, very unusual for a restaurateur, because we close, we get to kind of remake ourselves every year. We get to come up with kind of a couple of new motives and a couple of new things that we want to express.
What do you think the future is for dining in America? I mean, on the one hand, we're all digging organic and local, but McDonald's is not going out of business.
Thank God.
Thank God.
People need to eat. I mean, to act like McDonald's is doing them a disservice is to be, I think, a bit out of touch. If you can afford not to eat there, congratulations. But there's a vast number of people that use McDonald's for their meals. But I think that what is the future is that restaurants, if we can call them that, like McDonald's, are going to be forced to do better. I think the future looks like the pressure of the community to say, yes, you're a central part of the way that we eat, but could we do better? And anything from a plastic straw to a more humane cattle treatment. I think that it can find itself inside of those companies, and I think it will be forced. Otherwise, people will find alternatives. But what I've seen recently, and I think that this trend continues, is a more fetishizing of cuisine and food, where we're going to have much smaller spaces doing very, very specific things, and people will sort of travel between these small places to create their daily meal. Cuisine and restaurants become more specialized and less generalists as a rule.
Does this mean food halls?
Well, break up a food hall into a street, and I think what I'm really kind of talking about is Tokyo, where you have one person who's obsessed with ramen, and they do 7 different kinds of ramen, and that's their restaurant. Extrapolate that. I think that's what the future of restaurants looks like.
And the future for your group?
We took a tough punch during COVID.
You had to close a couple of places, right?
We closed 3 restaurants during COVID. Yeah, and it was heartbreaking. I think like everyone, it was a very, very tough time. We've opened a few as well, and we've taken over a few. We've fully recovered as a company, but I think that it's gotten us into the position of having choices now. And I think where we're going to find ourselves is being disciplined about our approach to the future, taking on a couple of really meaningful projects per year. I've got an incredibly talented team, and they're busting at the seams to do their own things. So I think part of our future looks like giving agency to some of our core team and allowing them and supporting them in their own ventures.
Chef, it is an absolute pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you.
I've learned several things that I did not know, so thank you. But as I was saying, it's an absolute delight to meet you and chat with you, and I want to thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
John Fraser on Culinary Characters Unlocked. I'm David Page, and I'll see you next time.